There's a fraction of a second that almost nobody remembers because it goes by too fast. Someone asks if you can stay late at work, if you can take care of something that isn't really your responsibility, if you're going to show up to that event you have absolutely no interest in attending. And before you've even finished processing the question, it's already coming out of your mouth. Sure, no problem, of course. The answer just appears like a reflex, as if there were no space between the prompt and the reaction. And then somewhere on the drive home or in the quiet of the night, it shows up. That vague, slightly heavy feeling that you said something that wasn't quite what you meant. That once again, without really realizing it, you gave in. It's not guilt, not yet. It's something that comes before guilt. It's the moment when your body already knows it did something your mind hasn't fully processed. And if you pay attention, that instant reveals quite a lot about the forces that drive a good portion of everyday social decisions. Saying yes when we really want to say no isn't simply weakness or a lack of character. It's the result of a set of forces that operate in layers, some visible and many completely invisible. Understanding them isn't a theoretical exercise. It's the only way to start seeing clearly which parts of what we do each day actually reflect what we want, and which parts are driven by fear, habit, or the need for other people to keep thinking well of us. One of the oldest and most powerful of those forces is the need to belong. Human beings were not built for solitude or for constant conflict. For thousands of years, being cast out of the group was literally dangerous. Social rejection activated something in the brain that closely resembled physical pain, and that wasn't just a metaphor. Neuroimaging studies have shown that social exclusion activates the same brain regions as bodily pain. That evolutionary history didn't disappear just because we now live in cities and carry smartphones. It's still there, shaping our responses, pushing us to do what it takes to avoid being left out. When someone asks something of us and we sense that saying no might make them uncomfortable, what gets triggered isn't just a rational calculation about whether we have the time or the energy. What gets triggered is something more primitive, an alarm that the relationship might be at risk, that the other person might be disappointed, that they might see us differently, that we might come across as selfish, unreliable, or difficult. And faced with that possibility, the brain runs a fast and often flawed calculation. Better to give in now than to deal with that tension. The problem is that calculation doesn't account for what comes afterward. It only resolves the discomfort of the present moment. And the present gets bought very cheaply at the cost of something that builds over time, the exhaustion of consistently placing yourself below what everyone else needs. There's something else at work in this pattern, and it has to do with how we learn to function in social life. From a very young age, politeness is taught as a core value. Be kind, don't be a burden, don't cause trouble, think about others. Those are instructions that get written in deep, and in many contexts they're genuinely valuable. The problem comes when those instructions become so automatic that they stop being a choice and turn into a default way of existing. When kindness stops being something you choose and becomes something you simply cannot not do. Some people, when asked for something, don't even stop to wonder whether they want to do it. The question they ask themselves, almost without noticing, is how to say yes in the way that causes the least friction. The possibility of saying no outright never even appears as an option, not because they don't have the right, but because they learned so thoroughly to be available that their own boundaries got buried under layers of automatic accessibility. Guilt is another key player in this process, and it's worth looking at closely because it works in a particularly sneaky way. Guilt doesn't wait for you to actually do something wrong. It shows up in advance as a warning, right at the moment when you're considering saying no. Before the refusal even leaves your mouth, guilt is already there. Who am I to say no to this? Am I being too self-centered? Is it really that big a deal? And that preemptive guilt is often enough to dismantle any intention of setting a boundary. What's interesting is that this guilt is almost never proportionate to the actual situation. It's excessive. It shows up with the same intensity whether someone is asking something reasonable or something completely unreasonable. It doesn't distinguish well between a fair limit and an act of cruelty. For preemptive guilt, saying no to almost anything can feel like abandoning someone in their moment of need. And that means the internal bar for justifying a refusal gets set impossibly high, as if you needed an airtight, unassailable reason to say no. And if the reason doesn't reach that standard, you might as well just go along with it. Social pressure also doesn't need to be explicit to do its job. Nobody has to directly say they'll be upset if you don't do what they're asking. A slightly deflated tone of voice is enough. A silence that stretches a second too long. A look that hints at expectation. Human beings are extraordinarily good at reading those signals and even better at anticipating them. We often give in to pressure that hasn't even happened yet, to a reaction we imagined, but that might never have come. The conflict we're trying to avoid is sometimes a hypothetical conflict we built ourselves before the other person said a word. This connects to something psychology has been studying for decades: the difference between a deliberate response and an automatic one. Much of what we do in social life doesn't go through careful, conscious reflection. It runs through emotional habits that fired before the thinking mind had time to step in. When someone asks us something directly in a social situation, the window for responding feels very narrow. And in that brief space, what comes out isn't what we'd say after calm consideration. It's what's most available, most rehearsed, most automated. And if what we've practiced most is giving in to avoid tension, that's what's going to come out. The habit of saying yes has a short-term logic that makes it very effective in the moment and very costly over time. The instant we give in, the tension releases. The relationship feels intact. The other person is satisfied, and we feel, at least briefly, like we came through. But something accumulates underneath. A growing inventory of things we agreed to do but didn't want to, events we showed up to without wanting to be there, favors given from a place of exhaustion, personal time surrendered without anyone ever giving it back. And that inventory has weight. Sometimes it shows up as a vague tiredness, sometimes as a resentment that doesn't quite have a name, sometimes as the feeling that you're always available for everyone except yourself. Setting limits isn't simply a rational decision you make once and move on from. It's a capacity that requires tolerating something genuinely uncomfortable. The possibility that the other person will be disappointed, that the situation will get tense, that the relationship will shift, even if only for a moment. For a lot of people, that discomfort is enough to push back any intention of holding a boundary. Not because they're weak, but because the nervous system registers that possibility as a real threat and activates the same mechanisms it uses in response to any social danger. The tension that precedes a genuine boundary isn't only psychological. You feel it in the body, in the chest, in the throat, in that impulse to soften what you're about to say, so it lands more gently, so the other person receives it better, so it doesn't feel like a rejection, when really it's just an honest answer. Recognizing this pattern doesn't fix anything automatically, but it does something that has to come before any real change. It makes visible what was operating in the shadows. Because as long as the mechanism is invisible, the only thing a person experiences is its effects, the exhaustion, the discomfort, the feeling of having given in once again. When the mechanism itself starts to become visible, something shifts. Not all at once, not in some dramatic way, but genuinely. The difficulty of saying no is not, at its core, about courage or strength. It's about clarity, about being able to notice, before fear or guilt or habit speaks first, what you actually want or need in that moment. Not what seems reasonable to want, not what the other person expects you to want, but what's there underneath the automation, waiting to be heard. Holding on to that desire in the face of pressure, in the face of someone else's expectant silence, in the face of your own preemptive guilt, doesn't require opposition or becoming unavailable to the people around you. It requires something harder and more fundamental: learning to listen to yourself with the same attention you've always given to everyone else.